My name is Karl Augustine, and I am a forest officer. My official designation is wildlife officer. However, my day-to-day focus is on sustainable land management, and basically I manage that unit as well as I'm involved in project implementation, some level of outreach, and as well as my main task or my main objective as I see it, as I understand it, is basically to help St. Lucians manage their land in a manner that is more sustainable and a manner that will actually meet the objectives of food sovereignty, food security, the protection of the biodiversity, and protection of our soil and water resources, and so on. Right? So, how did I get involved in this? From young, I like to say that I'm a dumb Lucian, meaning that I was born in Dominica and spent the first, 18, 20 years of my life in Dominica. But I've been in St. Lucia for the last 20 years, that's around 20, 21 years. And most of my work experience, especially the experience in forestry, is in St. Lucia, right? So I studied forestry engineering in Cuba between 1997 and 2003. And it was basically a calling for me. I felt at home. I knew that I needed a job that would have me outdoors a lot, right? As well as interacting with nature, right? I taught for a few years, and I've been with the forestry department from 2007. Okay, so if I offer a little background on the forestry department and the type of work that we do. Forestry in St. Lucia is forestry department is an old department. It's an old agency, and it came about after the Wavin Paso disaster that happened somewhere in the 30s, which is still where you had a massive landslide in the Badlil Wavin Paso area. It is still the largest disaster, natural disaster, from a loss of life perspective in St. Lucia, right? Where a big chunk of that hill washed away during heavy rainfalls, and you had many dozens of people losing their lives, and an entire community actually being completely dispossessed. Back then, the colonial government recognized that, boy, land management, especially on the hinterland, was something that needed some focus. So they created, after that disaster, the first set of hill reserves. And then that led now to the formulation of the Soil and Water Ordinance in 1945. We became enforced in 1946. And that brought about the, the forestry department as an agency. Even if, for example, the agency has changed names from a department to a division, or it may actually be located in the Ministry of Agriculture or the Ministry of Sustainable Development in our recent past. But the objectives are still the same. Objectives of protecting the hinterlands. There's a forest reserve that we operate within, which is just around 10,000 hectares, or around 25,000 acres. And we also have some mandate for the mandate of protection and management of wildlife resources or fauna resources, no matter where it is found on island. Right? We also do some level of joint management with on crown lands that are managed by other agencies and so on over the years. You could say that the work that the forestry department has done is kind of accentuated by disasters. Right? You had now the passing of Hurricane Allen in 1980, where you had seriously strong winds, serious destruction to our forest reserve and basically all forests, all vegetation on island. And that brought about a few things. One, in 1981, they came up with the Wildlife Act, which for the first time actually had a law that actually dedicated solely to the management of our fauna biodiversity on island. And what you find now happening during that period is forestry receives investment. You had a lot of young officers being sent to train to get their diplomas and so on. And forestry became a lot more than just being custodian, physical custodian, or what they would have said, bailiff boy, right? And more of started the foundation of a science-based institution, a science-based agency. In 1983, you also had the basically renewal, an update of the Soil and Water Ordinance of 1945 that built on what was there and also took into consideration the need to focus on land management, not just in the reserve, to deal with issues of squatting and squatters and so on. Especially, as we were transitioning to the green gold era, the era of banana plantation and so on. Right? Then if we move forward, we could look at the impact of Tropical Storm Debbie in 1994, which saw but before I touch on Debbie, I would like to just go back to say that in the 1980s, although there are other colleagues that are supremely more qualified to speak about the impact on the wildlife per se, I think it is also pertinent to mention that during that period, after the impact of Hurricane Allen, you had serious concerns for the national bird. It was felt that we had less than 10 of them alive in the wild. And that brought about a serious change, a change in the opinion and mindset of St. Lucians, where people saw the bird as a representation of their nationality, of their national pride. And also forestry basically led with a grassroots education, environmental education campaign around the parrot as a flagship species that was later on copied by other islands, right? And that was basically a cutting edge approach to wildlife management where you would have foresters go into all schools, from primary, secondary. You had a long-lasting campaign to save the jackal, to build that national awareness, right? Before that, you would have people hunting the birds and so on. During that period after Hurricane Allen, a moratorium was placed on hunting that actually helped to allow some of those species to recover after that serious shock, right? But also, the department started the management of our resource on the ground and the forest that would actually help to favor the reappearance and the rebuilding resilience in the populations of our terrestrial fauna and so on, right? So I go back to Tropical Storm Debbie, where the impact was less of wind damage, but more rainfall events, where you had a number of rivers changing their courses and so on. And that brought about the impact was more felt by farmers. Because you had a river that was probably 2 or 3 passes away from you, and all of a sudden the river is flowing through your land. You would have lost your banana production, you would have lost your ability to actually farm your land and so on. Forestry during that 1980s, 1990s period invested heavily in forestry extension. And we recognize that it's one thing to say, hey, to run behind a farmer, a land manager and say, hey, but you're not doing the correct thing, so we're going to penalize you. But it's another thing to also say, here are the best practices. We will help you implement those best practices on your land jointly. Because we as a collective all benefit from the land being sustainably managed and so on. Now, one of the recent serious impacts we had happened in 2010 with the passage of Hurricane Thomas. And then now in 2012 where you had the Christmas Eve trough, right? And during that period of time, it was also a rainfall event, a rainfall impact event. And we at forestry estimated that we had almost 600 hectares worth of degraded lands, landslides, mass wasting, and then you had a lot of flooding downstream. A lot of the riparian forests, as the forests you have around your rivers, your water bodies, were destroyed. You had a lot of impact, and you also even had loss of life, where one of our colleagues in the Fort Jack area perished because of storm surge, no, not storm surge, because of a flash flood, right? After this, forestry had to change our operational stance. We got some funding from the Australian aid. So we in the form of a project called the Post Hurricane Thomas Rehabilitation and Restoration Project, as well as investment from the state, serious investment from the state, right? Under that project, what we aimed to do was to create quick cover in those degraded areas, these areas where you had massive landslides and so on. So we had to do erosion control measures, where we try to either do things like check dams and wattling to reduce on the sediment load that was flowing from the hillside. And then now we try to create vegetative cover with the use of shrubbery and grasses and species like the vetiver and species like the fatpo and so on. Even the broadcasting of certain seeds, and we also had a robust approach of observation. Research try to learn so that by in the future we know how to react to such impacts, right? To see whether or not the interventions that we did, how they actually compared to natural regeneration, and so on. Whether or not we would just leave it alone and allow nature to take its course, or whether or not doing those erosion control measures would actually create basically the platform for natural regeneration or assist the planting that we did, right? We also, during that period of time under the Augustine project, we invested in germplasm, because we have a concept what they call the fly nursery, the temporary nursery, where more or less if you are doing intervention in an area, it makes sense to establish a germplasm bank near to that zone. It will reduce on your cost of transportation for your interventions, but will also now make it easier because the plants will suffer from less shock in terms of shock from the change in habitat and so on, right? Now, once the project actually ended, we did not close down all of those nurseries. However, what we tried to do was to transition those nurseries into co-managed community-based nurseries. Although the project also focused mainly on government land, the forest reserve, we recognize that along the riverbanks, a lot of the lands that were impacted were lands that were productive, lands that were important for food production, lands that were important for export of bananas and other agricultural products, which is an essential livelihood activity, and a major component of our economy, right? So the decision was taken to start working with those farmers and to try a different approach where we would use our nurseries to focus on species that have economic value, fruit bearing and other species that have economic value. We also took a decision to say, hey, since we want to ensure that we have good biodiversity, good genetic diversity, that our nurseries would be focusing on heirlooms instead of doing mainly clones. And that now we figured would have assisted us in conserving some of those naturalized cultivars, naturalized varieties that we have, and will also now create that kind of diversity that would build resilience against pest and disease and so on. And we were able now to convince a lot of the farmers that, hey, protecting your riverbank is a strategic move. Because once you lose your land through erosion, you can never get it back. But if we come and we work with you and we put in species that can give you the ecosystem services of protecting your soil and water, of the thermoregulation, a refuge for diversity, for biodiversity, fauna biodiversity, right? Windbreaks and so on. And at the same time, you are able to get a good that you can sell, a fruit that you can sell, a fruit that you can add value to. We can also help to reintroduce some of those rare species that was once abundant. The bui, the kainit, the apricots and so on. You know, that was once abundant and once consumed widely but had actually kind of died out, right? A lot of farmers actually took that up. Since that project funded by the Australian government, forestry has also implemented a number of Jeff funded, big Jeff funded projects. One of which is the iron ore project on the northeast coast of the island, the southeast coast project, which focuses on that zone between Dennery to PI, the IW Eco project, which focuses on the upper watershed in Soufrière, right? And a number of the GCCA as well through OECS, and the GCCA stands for the Global Climate Change Alliance, which is the EU funding arm for climate change intervention. So we did things like the mango biodiversity. We did some intervention on the Bois d'Orange River and so on. So we have done a number of projects that are geared towards building resilience and promoting sustainable land management. Over the years as well, we have also done some research into different cropping systems. Systems now that, because when we look at it, the idea of restoration, we know, is not one that is a short-term goal. This is a goal that usually lasts 30, 40 years, right? And then we recognize too that you have a lot of land use changes because people are unable to see the value of just having a forest. But if we could actually come up with a cropping systems that have high value, that you could do below the forest cut, that could actually help farmers that have that vegetative cover to actually make money while keeping the trees there. So we did some research in the vanilla on trellis. We're also doing research on growing orchids on standing trees. We're also looking at a pluriculture approach where you create your basically a fruit forest, and below that you do things like your different types of anthurium lilies, gingers, heliconias, and so on, and things like your orchids, things like your vanilla, which are high, all of which are high value products, right? At the moment, forestry has also, you could say, so we went from having one or two nurseries to now we have a network of them. We have four. We have our central nursery close to where we are doing this interview here, but we also have 4 satellite nurseries, if you want to call them that, which are community based from the perspective of we get a lot of supplies from the community. We have gentlemen agreement with a lot of the farmers that we can go and prospect on their land to get wild seedlings, to collect wild fruit and so on, that can feed into the production system. And then we also now strategically piggyback on the funding from those projects to supply the materials and so on that can help to keep the price of those plants low. So the farmers can no longer say, hey, you know, I have to leave all the way south and drive up north for me to get plants. There are nurseries closer to your location. And I no longer have to say, boy, a $10 plant, or I have to wait to get a paper from extension. No, forestry actually will augment, you know, what is available on the market. Because what we want is for farmers to transition more and more into agroforestry, what they call agro-silvo-pastoral systems, which we know, based on evidence elsewhere and here, are more sustainable, are more productive, and require less implementation of pesticides and so on, and are therefore safer for our environment. Right? So the forestry department today we have not lost our focus on protecting our forest reserve, which by and large, is protected and secure. But we are recognizing in 2015 we did our strategic plan, 10-year strategic plan, 2015 to 2025. And in that plan we declared forest as global. What does that mean? Forest being global means that no matter where the forest is located on island, we will help you manage it. So we are not just concerned about managing our 10,000 hectares and forest that is from government land managed, vested in different government agencies. But we will help you manage your half acre. We will give you advice. We will make plants available to you, even if it is in your backyard. Even if it is, we try to work with the schools. And that's one of the things that I missed to say, but I will make sure that I make mention of it, is that we also came up with a novel approach to doing some of the interventions on the riverbanks and in degraded areas, where we work with our schools, we work with our community groups, but we even work with some of our commercial partners, right? To actually do things like what? Do the planting. So forestry would engage with the landowner, with the farmer. We would actually help to do some of the land prep. And then we would bring in our social partners, be they school children, be they community groups, be they commercial. And we would actually do the implementation, the planting and so on, utilizing, you could say, community power, right? And that now basically ticks a few boxes. One, we are engaging more than just the farmer who is the beneficiary. We are engaging people in some instances who normally don't do that type of work. And we are helping now to build their awareness. When people participate in that, usually there is a fervor that they themselves want access to plants that they can plant in their yard. They themselves might tell you, hey, I have a variety of that growing in my backyard there. I can bring you some seeds. And all of that now contributes towards the collective action that we need to take as a society, right? Because we're operating in a context where what? We're dealing with climate change. And climate change and climate variability brings about some negative impacts where we may get 2 months worth of rain in a week or two. Right? We're dealing with an era where, because of climate change, we have more land degradation, especially we are a mountainous country. And we must admit that some of our cropping approaches in the past has been monocultures, which reduce on the resilience, of the terrain, the resilience of the land. Right? And we also know, because of the fact that we are doing so much land use change for either commercial or housing, or for the development of our tourism product, that at the end of the day, we may be having a negative impact on biodiversity. But those impacts that those are interventions that we've been doing, will actually help us comply with some of what we have actually committed to internationally under those conventions. So we have on the land that whole commitment to say, land degradation neutrality. So if we basically degrade or change, reduce on the vegetative cover of a 5-acre plot, that we actually build the resilience on a 5-acre plot elsewhere, right? The fact that we focus on certain native species and them kind of things from a biodiversity perspective, right? And that is also, and I would just take a little segment there, on the biodiversity, where we say we have a lot of resources that we do not know yet what their true value are, right? So it makes sense to save everything that is indigenous, everything that is native, because we may find out in 5 years that, hey, that plant we call a weed actually have certain chemical substances in it that might be essential as a medicine. can be good for example, livestock production or whatever. But if we eliminate it, then we have lost that forest. We also now need to have those native species because when the foreigners come and they do their bioprospecting, right? We can then now identify, hey, what you are selling in the form of a peel actually came from this plant here. So we need our benefits from you trying to commercialize that genetic resource that came from St. Lucia. So it is important that we conserve and preserve what we have, but we also build our knowledge bank of what we have. And that our professionals, our young and upcoming scientists, focus on doing work and research on those species, right? Because yes, we are doing certain work as part of our commitment, but the greater commitment is one of preserving our society and ensuring that we have the ability of feeding ourselves and the ability now of the future generations enjoying what is there now and in greater abundance. Right? So forestry, keeps moving on in terms of the interventions that we do, and we work very closely with the farmers. Every project that we actually get, we try to increase our list of beneficiaries. Because we recognize that it is one thing to say, boy, we comply with this or that and the other, and then a citizen asks you, but what does that mean for me? Because it's one thing to try to tell a man, hey, you benefited because of you get water or the air is fresh and so on. But a lot of times people want to see tangible benefits that are measurable. That they can say, hey, I got this. Look, I'm able to sell or I'm able to leverage this and I'm able to get a livelihood impact. Look, I am now able to do an investment to say, boy, I'm going to do some set of agro-processing and create a product that has value, either for our visiting market or for export or for our own consumption, right? And in order for that to happen, we believe that our efforts must continue.